Today's episode is sponsored by Vitality Health RX Supplements. Whether you're an athlete, a busy professional, or just someone looking to prioritize health, Vitality Health RX has what you need. With premium ingredients and rigorous quality control, their supplements support your body's natural functions. Visit shopvrx.com and use code FEELGREAT15 for 15% off your first order. Thanks to Vitality Health RX for sponsoring this episode. Now let's dive in.
Hi, and welcome to the Feel Better, Feel Great podcast, where each episode we dive into the wonders of holistic health and functional medicine so that you can grow with your knowledge to become healthier and have a happier life. I'm your host, Dr. Andrea McSwain. I am first of all very excited to present to you the Feel Better, Feel Great Functional Wellness membership that you can find more information about in the link below. This is definitely the way that I want to dive deeper into these topics. Today, the topic we're exploring in episode 141 is Functional Medicine Essentials, Lab Tests for Diabetes. This is a topic that touches many lives, and I want to offer intriguing insights into what you need to know for a better understanding of the diagnosis of diabetes. Please remember that this information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Always seek the advice of your physician with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or health objectives. I want to start out today with some compelling statistics that look at the sharp rise in diabetes globally and in the United States. There is a significant global increase. Diabetes cases have more than tripled globally over the last 30 years, with an estimated 537 million adults living with diabetes as of 2021. This number is expected to rise to 783 by 2045 if this is the current trend. In the United States, diabetes has increased significantly from 5.5 million adults in 1980 to over 37 million in 2023, meaning now that approximately 1 in 10 Americans have been diagnosed with diabetes. Additionally, pre-diabetes is rising at an alarming rate where 80% of people with pre-diabetes are unaware that they have it. And I'm going to talk to you about this because there's some really important terms and definitions here that are worth understanding so you don't get caught up necessarily in these diagnoses codes before you actually understand how you can help yourself. And that's the point. Just to tell you, this $327 billion have been discussed that's the cost of diabetes, with a marked 26% increase in just 5 years of costs. And it's also impacting our youth, that we have noticed a 95% increase in type 2 diabetes among U.S. youth. Additionally, there's a significant mortality rate as diabetes is linked to cardiovascular disease, which accounts for approximately 2/3 of deaths in people with diabetes. So here is what surprises me about diabetes, or this conversation on diabetes, is most people don't even have enough information from their labs to understand how it developed or what they need to do about it. We do need to understand, first of all, that this is how a lot of ways that you process carbohydrates. So I want to start with that as a basic understanding. Okay, so carbohydrates are also called glucose. You don't want to think about that necessarily as it's a sugar, it's a carbon molecule, but you have to really kind of separate this idea into sugar being related to glucose, obviously, and how we get carbohydrates in our bodies, but all carbohydrates break down into glucose, whether they're good carbohydrates or bad carbohydrates, if you want to have a dualism there. But anyway, glucose is a major fuel in our body, but we often diagnose diabetes with only 1 or 2 markers. And that's really important because you need to understand where these diagnoses are coming from and how they're kind of being blanketly applied. And so you want to understand the labs better so that you can understand how to reverse it. First of all, just understanding diabetes and its health impact. Of course, functional medicine is often focusing on the root cause of health issues rather than symptoms alone. And diabetes is a condition where blood sugar or blood glucose, so we'll go back and forth with those terms, remain high due to there's many different things actually. Insulin resistance or lack of insulin production. Those are worlds apart. Insulin resistance into the muscles is about how your muscles are not receiving the energy or the glucose that they need to do the work. The other definition of diabetes is a lack of insulin production. Now, insulin is produced by the pancreas, and so these are very different process and pathologies in the body that get lumped into this diagnosis of diabetes type 2. There are different types of diabetes. There's type 1, type 2, and gestational diabetes. Type 1 diabetes directly insults. In type 1 diabetes, there is a direct insult to the pancreas. The pancreas becomes very inflamed, potentially infected, which is a major theory for type 1 diabetes, and the pancreas shuts down. It is therefore required when people have type 1 diabetes that they need insulin. So this is a lack of insulin production in its most severe form. Type 2 diabetes is a huge bucket term. Usually type 2 diabetes is related to insulin resistance, but oftentimes it's actually evaluated by how much blood glucose levels are, or how much there is a certain marker that looks at blood sugar in the circulating blood. So those are really kind of the same thing. They just kind of have two different markers to evaluate them. Then in gestational diabetes, there is a lot of stress on the female when she's pregnant, and gestational diabetes shows that. So about 20% of people, I believe, with gestational diabetes will go on to develop type 2 diabetes. But it has to do with some dysregulation of how carbohydrates are processed when a woman is pregnant. And I can talk at length about that being an OB-GYN, but that's a different topic. So there's definitely very important to test regularly, and I'm going to talk about that. It's very important in any metabolic dysfunction to try to figure out as soon as you have it or if you're trending in that direction. And then recognizing that family history plays a role, often because that's how we learn to eat, sleep, take care of ourselves or not. And also, a lot of our habits around holidays and such come from our family. And then those lead into lifestyle risk factors. That's very important because this is also a key part of diabetes type 2, is its level of reversibility. It is a metabolic dysfunction. It is very important to recognize that there is many ways to reverse diabetes. Now, again, that's going to be a different podcast. I'm really excited to talk about it. But this first podcast is really on what are the tests, because you need to understand this. Then I want to explain that there are a lot of lab tests that I'm going to talk to you about because I'm tired of type 2 diabetes being this bucket of problems instead of appreciating the details. Okay, so there are a few tests you want to know about. First and foremost, directly related to diabetes. Fasting blood glucose. So you don't eat and you get your blood glucose tested. It's a blood test. It is a snapshot of your blood sugar or blood glucose levels. It's particularly important when you've had a period of fasting, approximately 8 hours where maybe you had water but nothing else. Okay. While normal fasting glucose can kind of range in their ideas, a lot of people say below 100. It used to be below 90. I really think kind of 80 is a sweet spot. You don't want to get too low, which is less than 60. That's another problem we'll talk about another time. But pre-diabetes is often being asserted now at 100 to 125, and diabetes is at this magic marker of 126. Okay, well, that's important because let's say you're going to get your labs drawn and there's some stress involved. Well, that can raise your blood sugar, right? So that can be a marker that has some errors. The other thing is if people are struggling with chronic bacterial infections, that can slightly elevate fasting blood glucose levels. So there's a few other things there that play into it. Okay, well then what do we look at? A lot of times people will look at hemoglobin A1C. Hemoglobin A1C measures average blood glucose levels over the past 3 months, supposedly a reliable indicator of long-term blood sugar control. However, this is very different in different ethnicities. It's very different if someone has thalassemia or sickle or some kind of abnormal shape to their hemoglobin. It's also significant if someone has anemia. That's going to change hemoglobin A1C levels and probably raise those levels. Okay. And then the other thing is looking at hemoglobin A1C, it is actually a marker on a red blood cell that's related to a glucose marker. So if you have any change in your red blood cell, erythrocyte, then hemoglobin A1C can be inaccurate. The other thing that's very important to remember about a 3-month average is it could be very high and very low, and then you get an average. Okay, so your blood sugar can have a lot of spikes and troughs, but this is taking an average. So I think about like you have a savings account, or rather you have a checking account, and maybe you have a lot of money in it, and then maybe you have a little bit of money in it. So there's spikes and troughs, but this is an average. And so I think that's very important. One thing I like to look at are some other markers. So fasting blood glucose and hemoglobin A1C are the most common used metrics for diabetes diagnosis. However, they're fraught with confusion. They're not specific enough. They don't help you understand the source of the problem, and that's very aggravating to me. There's a few things I like to look at. First, you can actually measure insulin resistance. Okay, and I'm going to go into this quite a bit. So the test is HOMA-IR. Insulin resistance is related to how much your body muscles do not allow insulin to come into the muscles to provide the glucose, meaning your muscles have developed a resistance to actually receive fuel. And insulin resistance is much more classically the idea of diabetes type 2. Well, how can you feel that? Well, you get tired in your leg muscles. You can't walk as far. You don't have the energy that you used to in doing things. Okay, so that's how you can symptomatically kind of see insulin resistant as it affects your muscles. What can you do about it? Just a side note, but very important. Have a little bit of a carb fuel before you exercise. So kind of give yourself a little bit more right before you exercise, like 15 to 40 grams. So you're looking at small apple, a big apple, something like that. And that will then give you a little more blood sugar so that your body can accept it into the muscles. Glycated protein is another important lab marker. It's called GSP, glycated protein. Now this is a important marker because it relates to your stress response, releasing blood sugar. It's the thing if you're being chased by a tiger, right? And so oftentimes people who have higher glycated protein, they will get very shocked by things, or they'll get very reactive if something like the door slams a little bit heavier. If someone raises their voice, or you hear clapping, or they hear something loud coming from the car or something, they'll get very edgy. And that's usually a very big dump of blood sugar related to stress, and it goes into their blood supply. So it's a lot of sugar that's released as a stress response from adrenal overdrive, sympathetic overdrive. This is important, and as a side note, this can be modulated with half a teaspoon of cinnamon, any kind, in food or whatever, in the day, not by itself. So cinnamon, half a teaspoon daily to help modulate your glycated protein. Well, that's very important, right? Okay, so what are some other important markers? Well, insulin levels are very important because the insulin is secreted from the pancreas, and pancreatic health is incredibly important for longevity. I say the pancreas is the organ of longevity. I'm not the only one that says that. So when the pancreas is stressed, you're looking at a pretty significant problem. Oftentimes, insulin production can go into hyperdrive. It's better to measure insulin to get a better picture of what's happening, because we're always looking for longevity and quality of life metrics. So insulin evaluation is significant, not just for finding out if you have diabetes, but also looking at your metabolic health and looking at longevity. So definitely a big fan of looking at insulin. If insulin is over 10, usually 15, in the values of the tests that I use, then I know that the body is producing a lot more insulin from the pancreas. The pancreas is working harder. This usually corresponds to insulin resistance. The body is making more insulin from the pancreas. So the body is making more insulin to help the muscles get more energy. How does this play out? This has a lot to do as well with the brain as a muscle. So it's a very important dynamic to think about the brain, because the brain is a muscle using a lot of blood glucose. So sometimes if the insulin is high and the insulin resistance is high, then we're wondering from a cognitive perspective, is the person ruminating? Are they overthinking? There's not really a lab for that, but it definitely corresponds to the idea of giving someone a diagnosis of diabetes and starting them on a cascade of medications, and just kind of like you're in trouble now, be afraid of diabetes, instead of you're ruminating all the time. And it's very important to look back at lifestyle to consider how you feel better and how you kind of can take a step back, be aware, be calm, turn off your brain. Think about your brain as a muscle, turn it off, and then look then at how much more activity you can do in your muscles, and then your insulin going down. Okay, so that's when you kind of look at functional medicine, right? The mind, body, emotions, and their combination together. I have seen multiple times in my practice where I've done the right thing, right? So I've given the correct supplements. So this is like Mother Nature's metformin is called chromium. So there's chromium, vanadium, alpha-lipoic acid, berberine. I mean, basically anything. Mother Nature gives you so many great ways to help regulate your carbohydrates and how they can actually then provide the appropriate fuel into your body. Remember, carbohydrates are about fueling your body in a very accessible way so that you can have energy for your body to work. It's not a good idea to ignore carbohydrates. It's not a good idea to take in junky carbohydrates that are synthetics, right? So a lot of candy or soda, all these things will give you carbohydrates, but they will give you carbohydrates that are very low quality. And you need good quality energy to come in. We label those as carbohydrates. We look at kilocalories for measuring that, and then those go into the body. When we see that when the carbohydrates go into the body, they fuel the body. So you need good quality fuel. So that really matters. And you don't need a lot, right, of carbohydrates. So, a lot of people look at 100 grams a day, 150 grams a day, and you really want to avoid the idea of 300 grams a day. So this is, again, you're looking at a lab, but then you're also looking at what's behind the lab. So if you are counting your carbs, and there's validity in just understanding your numbers, right? Everybody says that, understand your numbers, know something about what's going on. So I definitely value labs, but let's look at what you're actually putting into the system. So let's say you're putting in 300 grams of carbs a day. You're having quinoa 3 times a day, right? And you're like, okay, well, that's giving me, I think a half a cup of quinoa is 42 grams. So you're having a cup of quinoa 3 times a day. You're getting 250 grams of carbohydrates from quinoa. So quinoa is a very good protein source, right? Plant-based, blah, blah, blah. But it's got a lot of carbohydrates when you're using a lot of it. So let's say that's happening. And then you have all your other carbs. So you're definitely exceeding 300. And that's a very high number. But maybe you look to 150 grams of carbohydrates. That's a very well-balanced amount of carbohydrates. We start to see how your fasting glucose would go down. We'd start to see how your 3-month average would go down with your hemoglobin A1C. And we'd really start to see, though, that you're getting good quality carbs in a good amount of fueling the system, but you're not overwhelming the system. So you don't have a lot of circulating blood glucose. And that's a really good point, right? And then your body is actually able to get enough fuel. And timing is really important for fueling the body as well. And that's where it can help insulin resistance go down as a biomarker, as a lab test, so that you can see how you can reduce insulin resistance. The other way to reduce insulin resistance is turn off your brain. Because again, the brain is a huge muscle. And I've seen this time and time again. I've probably done these tests about 500 times in the last 6 years. And I've seen them go down very well. We've had a patient with an insulin level of 96 5 years ago who now lives at about 15 or 16. That's a pretty good change. We noticed a 96 down to 48 within a year, and then the insulin level continued to stay down and low. And now this person has done this is a great metric to go from 96, which is the highest insulin level I've ever seen. I often see 29, 40, and it usually takes us about 6 months to get that into the high teens. And that's a remarkable change in just doing that with Inflamex Shake and our advanced metabolism, which is vanadium and chromium together, and the person taking half a teaspoon of cinnamon in their food a day. These are very simple things to make sure that we're lowering inflammation, because that's important as well. We don't see that in these markers necessarily. And then reducing insulin resistance, so then the body reduces the production of insulin. So kind of reverse engineering that idea so that you can see that flow. And the remainder of the time, I want to talk mostly about another test that's been used over the years, and it's being kind of substituted for a home kit tool. So oral glucose tolerance test, OGTT, is often used in gestational diabetes. It can be used to confirm type 2 diabetes, but that's not often done. But for those of us who have had to endure an oral glucose tolerance test to see if we have diabetes, in pregnancy, we have to sit there for 2 hours. Well, it's very important, right? You get 3 tests drawn. You get when you come in, you get 1 hour later and 2 hours later. And so these are called immediate, if you will, testing. And then you have 1 hour postprandial and 2 hour postprandial. And at 1 hour postprandial, it's acceptable for you to have a level up to 140. At 2 hours postprandial, up to 120. And then the blood glucose will decline. So that shows us when we're eating, we get a load of glucose that goes into the blood. That's why I recommend that when people are going to go exercise, they get a little bit of glucose into the body. Now, an OGTT is a high amount of just this awful syrupy drink. But if you use it in a healthy form, you'd have an apple, right? Or, some carrot juice or something amazing for you that would fuel your muscles. Your muscles would start working. They would pump better, get better blood supply, more energy. And when the whole body's pumping, the body's doing better. Okay, so I'm going to now talk about what I said I was going to talk about, which is OGTTs are obviously done in the lab. They take hours every day. Some people are using home glucose monitoring. And I did a debate or something when I was in residency over the discussion of home glucose monitoring for people who were pregnant. And there really wasn't, there was just really equivocal research as to its efficacy, meaning, that's my answer. And if you know me, I use that answer sometimes because it means okay, you might get something from it, but a lot of times you're gathering data that doesn't really make sense or doesn't really provide consistency. So when you use a home glucose monitoring, you want to use it with some kind of systemization so you can actually look at values. So I would recommend, in its most basic form, if you are going to use a home glucose monitor, that you look at using fasting. Okay, so you wake up in the morning and you check your value. And then look at immediately after you eat something, and then 1 hour after you eat that, and 2 hours after you eat that. So those timings will give you some consistency. Am I recommending that you do this every day? No, not at all. I'm not recommending that at all. If you are using this to kind of appreciate how you process glucose and also foods that you use and eat that might be spiking your blood sugar, it's a good idea to use an oral glucose, a home glucose monitor, so that you can understand there might be some things that are elevating your glucose levels, your blood glucose levels, that you might not have appreciated. And everybody's a little different. Sometimes someone has food A and it spikes their blood sugar. Other times people have this other thing, it spikes their blood sugar. So if you're dealing with blood sugar dysregulation, you might want to use a home glucose monitoring. I often can encourage people to use symptom-based ideas. So if they get brain fog, fatigue after they eat something, that's something that could be causing some aggravation in their body. If people get a lot of energy really fast, obviously if you have something that's loaded with sugar, what happens usually is people get really high and then they tank. So that is a very important concept to remember in blood sugar regulation, is that it's very important to maintain a steady state. Big spikes and big troughs cause big problems because our body likes to stay balanced. If your blood glucose is elevating to 200 or 300 after what you're eating, that food is not good for you, right? So it's either a huge carb load, it might need more protein sources. This is probably a good idea to come into the functional wellness membership so we can discuss, if you're spiking and troughing, what you can do to kind of stabilize. And I can also give you some more information about that. So I wanted to highlight today Functional Medicine Essentials Lab Test for Diabetes. I wanted to hope that you really get some perspective on what is diabetes. And I'm just afraid that people are being put into this bucket, because a lot of times when people get a diagnosis, it kind of becomes the end of the road. Like, oh, I have diabetes, so, now I'm going to have heart disease, and now my kidneys aren't going to work. And okay, let's slow down. Diabetes is reversible. Type 2 diabetes is reversible. The other issue is you have control over your body, and you need to have education to understand, first of all, what are the lab tests? Because I can almost guarantee you're not actually getting a thorough enough understanding of the happenings of blood sugar dysregulation to then decide what action to take. Okay, so using the labs effectively is very important. And then looking to lifestyle to understand this. And then looking to Mother Nature's medicine. Looking to herbs, looking to minerals that our body needs, not just to control blood sugar, but to look at a lot of other things that are really important that can be supported when we use certain nutrients like alpha-lipoic acid for nerve health, as well as for blood sugar regulation. It's a wonderful antioxidant. So that's just an example of a really important nutrient for people who have type 2 diabetes or have been told they have type 2 diabetes, so that they can actually get better for the long run. So I want to thank you. I definitely want to ask you to please leave a comment, a question, something for clarification. I have found out from several people that I will sometimes say something that I like or don't like, but I don't give what I, kind of that follow-up element. So if you feel like I've done that, then just tell me, because I'll fill in the blank and do my best to not leave blanks. I really want to give you a lot of information, so I try to kind of gear and present the information, knowing that these are really deep subjects. They're very complicated. I have worked very hard over my career as a doctor to provide ways for people to take salient points and give some analogies or try to break it down. But sometimes there's just some other elements that I need to include. So it really helps me be a better doctor if you share with me something that was not clear. I would really appreciate that. So I want to tell you too, I use Boston Heart Diagnostics. It's a huge panel. It's well covered by insurance. I want to thank Boston Heart. We've been using them now for 7 years. We've done hundreds and hundreds, like I've said, and I have paid for Medicare permissions. So it's a special application for Medicare. So this test is covered for Medicare in its entirety. The Boston Heart is very well covered. They do sliding scale. They do all these dynamics to help people get really quality information to you. I think that's remarkable. And they also tell you if it's cash pay, what it's going to be. And I just can't say enough nice things about Boston Heart, as well as the accuracy and thoroughness of a cardiometabolic panel that doesn't just look at these very important biomarkers, but it also looks at some critical nutrient levels for the heart and for diabetes and for nerve health and all those things, including omega-3s, B12, folate, vitamin D. It's incredible. It also looks at DHEA, aldosterone, cortisol, because a lot of diabetes has a lot to do with glandular dysfunction or adrenal dysfunction, as well as being a cardiac issue. Then that's why I really love working with Boston Heart and giving that test to my patients. I do a very thorough Boston Heart. If you're working with a cardiologist, ask them, because cardiometabolic panel of Boston Heart is in the cardiovascular community, meaning cardiologists will use that lab company. Like I said, it's really covered by insurance. It's an independent company from Quest and LabCorp, so it's not Cleveland Heart, which I think is part of Quest now. So Boston Heart does a really great job. Like I said, a lot of cardiologists use that test and just say, like, can you do most of that panel? Because you're really going to get some good insights on things that will help you control your cardiometabolic health. Thank you again for joining me today. If this resonated with you, if you could subscribe to our podcast, leave a review, share it with friends and family. Because of the predominance of this subject in our society, I think there's some people that might gain some insights into this. And I want to thank our sponsor, Vitality Health RX, which you can find at shopvrx.com. So shopvrx.com for all these supplements that I actually vet and know how I use in my clinic to get success. Thank you again. Have a beautiful day.